Can you hear me now? Yeah, that's much better. Okay. So what you guys might not realize is that Sweden is one of the leaders in the field on research in Paleolithic diets and nutrition. Between the work that Staffen started doing more than 20 years ago and the clinical trials that they've been doing now, really they have done more than anybody else so far in terms of looking at Paleolithic nutrition and its effects on diets. And in the United States, I think that now we're starting to see more people who are interested in the idea of, is there a better nutritional way? And certainly when I started doing this kind of research, I mean, I'm a kidney doctor, and we were not looking to study Paleolithic nutrition. Okay? I work for a group that looks at acid-base balance, and diet affects acid-base balance. And what we wanted to do was we wanted to come up with a diet that was low in acid, because typical Western diets are high in acid. And fruits and vegetables contain a lot of alkaline, and so we were looking for a diet that had lots of fruits and vegetables in it, and we came up with a Paleolithic diet. And since then, I have become a real enthusiast because, and I'll talk about this later, but kidney disease is a disease generally of people with diabetes, high blood pressure, and obesity. And the Paleolithic diet dramatically affects these three factors. And so if you had to say to yourself, how could I prevent kidney disease? It would be by preventing diabetes, high blood pressure, and obesity more than anything else. So when I look at clinical trials, I'm not just looking at diet. And I think that in the United States, there's a kind of amorphous movement of people who sort of look at diet, and then they look at some other things too. So, for example, on top of diet, there's the effects of chronic stress and being physically inactive, not getting enough sun, not getting enough sleep. There's some data coming out now on maybe it's what's happening inside your intestines and the gut microflora, and how does that affect your health. And that all together, this leads to a suboptimal phenotype so that you get sicker faster and die. So when we talk about clinical trials, in the old days, the idea was that there were scientists in the laboratory, and they came up with ideas, and then they practiced them first in animals, and then we went to the humans and we did some trials in humans, and then finally we brought it out to the community and we tried to make it more diffusely available. And so some of the things that I'm going to talk about first are these kinds of clinical trials. So UCSF OSHR, that's us, and I'll show you some of that data in a minute. The people on this list, by the way, are people who are particularly interested in, I'm going to say, Paleolithic lifestyles. Stephen Guyonet is a PhD researcher in obesity. Richard Feynman and Eric Westman have done, they're diabetologists. They've done a lot of work on low-carb diets. And Robert Lustig is a pediatrician who's particularly interested in obesity in children and has been studying the effects of high fructose corn syrup on weight and metabolic parameters in children for many years. As you can realize, because there are many environments on the planet, there is no one diet. Staffen talked about that in some detail. But our diet, and we did our first study in healthy, sedentary people. So to qualify for this study, we put you on a treadmill, and you had to fail the treadmill test in order to qualify for the study. We didn't want anybody who exercised too much. And we fed them a diet which is about 2/3 fruits and vegetables and 1/3 meat, fish, and nuts. And to compare, I'm using the Premier diet. So this was a study in sort of middle-aged, overweight women who, over 6 months, exercised and lost a bunch of weight. And if you look at their fasting insulin and glucose levels, you see their insulin levels went down 9% and their glucose dropped 4%. In our study, and I work for a metabolic research center, so we make all the food, and we give the people all the food, and we weigh them every day, and we do a lot of tests for a couple of days before we start, and then a couple of days at the end, and then we average the results. So in our women, and this is after our people, after 2 weeks, okay, with no weight loss, because we do our studies so that we don't want weight interfering with our results. So no weight loss. Their insulin levels dropped 68% and their glucose dropped 5%. And when we looked at their lipid profiles, I apologize, these are in milligrams per deciliter as opposed to millimoles per liter. But this kind of decrease in cholesterol and triglycerides is the kind of result that you get after somebody's been on a statin for 6 months. And we did this in 2 weeks with no weight loss. So this was actually an astounding result. And as a kidney doctor, I was like, wow, look at this. Later on, and I'll talk about this later, we did a similar study in people with type 2 diabetes and found that really they were eating a terrible diet to begin with, because one arm got the American Diabetes Association arm and the other arm got our Paleolithic diet arm. And they all improved, everybody improved, because they were just eating junk food to begin with. But the ones that improved the most, okay, were the ones whose blood pressure dropped the most when we took the salt away on the Paleolithic diet. And I'll talk about that later. There's been a lot of research in low-carb diets. It's interesting to me that all of these studies, when they do the low-carb diets, those are not calorie-restricted diets. But when they put them on moderate-carb diets, they always calorie-restrict them. And yet the low-carb diets generally come out having improved drops in hemoglobin A. Yellow is clinically significant improvements compared to the moderate carb diet. Decreases in hemoglobin A1C, in BMI, in some psychological distress factors, and in red over here, these are trends to drops in triglycerides, fasting insulin. So low carb diets, and this is pretty much true, you'll see. Drops hemoglobin A1C, drops glucose, tends to drop lipids. And if you say, you know, what is a Paleolithic diet? I consider low-carb diets to be in the Paleolithic diet family, because really you could do it with, you know, meat and fish and, you know, a few fruits and vegetables, and that would be consistent with what Stefan was talking about earlier. And here's another study, again, just showing that if you put somebody on a low-carb diet compared to a regular carb diet, their glucose levels are lower, their insulin levels are lower, and over the course of a couple of weeks, their hemoglobin A1C drops more. So this has been an ongoing argument for people in the diabetes field now for years, that we should not be feeding carbohydrates to diabetics. They have problems with blood sugar control. What are we doing feeding them all these carbohydrates? This is some of Stephen's work on obesity. Rats and us like to eat high-fat food. When we eat high-fat food, we get excitatory neurotransmitters that excite our brain and make us eat more. So when you're eating a lot of high-fat food, you really like that and you just eat more of it. And Robert Lustig's studies, so if you guys ever have a chance, he does this YouTube video on why sugar is bad, and he has this whole complicated thing on the metabolism of fructose. But the bottom line is that fructose, like alcohol, is bad for your liver, causing a lot of oxidative stress and damage to the liver cells. And because he works with children, he sees this very high incidence of fatty liver disease in these relatively young children, 6, 8, 10 years old. And so he's been interested in looking at the metabolic pathways for that. Okay. So these are studies. The first ones were ones where they've done randomized trials. And then the next ones I'm going to talk about some other things that go along with kind of like a Paleolithic lifestyle. Eating behaviors, exercise, getting enough sleep, and stress reduction. Emily Deans is a psychiatrist at Harvard University who's particularly interested in the effects of nutrition on psychiatric disease. She does a blog where she talks about various foods and how they might be implicated in various types of psychiatric diseases. She's particularly interested in eating behaviors and how various foods affect people's psychiatric profiles and whether or not you can improve psychological or psychiatric diseases by changing their diet. We tell people that exercise is good for you. If you exercise, you'll live longer. This great study by this guy, James O'Keefe, who's a cardiologist somewhere in the Midwest, when he likes to do marathons. And so he did this study in people with marathons where he showed that after they ran a race, their troponin levels went up, which means that their cardiac muscle was dying. So your troponin levels go up when you have a heart attack. Okay. So after running a marathon, their troponin levels were elevated. And after running a lot of marathons, they began to develop scar tissue in their myocardium. So this is just like having a heart attack. And so he wrote this paper, and in his discussion section, he argues that too much exercise is bad for you. And he gives this great discussion about how, we should be limiting how much we do. And apparently, this just set people off. I mean, it was like, how could you say that exercise was bad? And really, it's like most things in life. Too little may be bad. Too much may be bad, just the right amount may be okay. And now we get to sleep. So this is a great study. I'm a doctor, okay? And I trained in the days when doctors never got enough sleep. So what they did here was they put everybody on a calorie-restricted diet, and then some of them only got to sleep 5 hours, and the others got to sleep 8.5 hours. And what they found was that although there was no difference in leptin, which is the hormone that suppresses appetite, there was a marked increase in ghrelin levels, which is the hormone that stimulates appetite. So the less you slept, the hungrier you got. And on top of that, your cortisol levels went up, which helped drive your glucose up. And your plasma epinephrine levels went up. And epinephrine is one of those fight or flight hormones, so it kind of increases your blood pressure and your heart rate and stuff. So if you're not getting enough sleep, you tend to eat more, and you tend to raise your blood sugar levels because of that. And I work with a group that teaches behavioral modification and stress reduction, which I think is important for doctors to learn. And so we teach it to medical students, which I think it's important for everybody to learn. So, and one of the things that we've been doing with, we do this particular type called EBT, which stands for emotional brain training. works on the idea that your brain cells can still learn even after you're as old as I am. And when they do this, we tell them to eat a paleo diet compared to, this is a cognitive behavioral therapy and a healthy diet. And so what they showed here was that in the arm that got the paleo diet and this emotional brain training, they lost more weight, their blood pressure went down more, their psychological scores improved more, and after they finished this study after 7 weeks, then 7 weeks after that, they retested them with no intervention in between. And the group that had gotten the standard therapy, which is this one over here, basically had gone back to baseline, while the EBT paleo group had managed to maintain their weight loss and their lower blood pressures. So those are some of the actual trials that people are doing on sort of Paleolithic diet and lifestyle. But really in the United States, I actually think that it's much broader than that, because this is one of the rare instances. There's a society called the Ancestral Health Society, and they've started doing annual meetings, and so I've been to a couple of them. And most of the people in that room are not doctors, they're not scientists, they're just people who are interested in this. And so actually, a lot of the communications on this in the United States is not being done from scientists and doctors, trying to do this, but is being spread around by the people in the community. So although these guys are some of the researchers who are doing this guy like Rob Wolf or Chris Kressler over here, these guys were interested in it for personal health. Mark Sisson, because he's an exercise guy. But these guys are just interested in it, and they blog about it. And when I was talking to some of the people that were in the audience and some of the people that we met there, they followed all these guys' blogs, and and they hitchhiked from Texas to come to LA so they could come to the meeting because they were really interested in this. And I thought that was totally fascinating. Some other things that I noticed when I talked about, what other kinds of paleo stuff is being done in the United States to kind of improve health. Well, one of the things is that now they've really started cracking down on fructose corn syrup. There's a lawsuit in Buffalo against the fructose manufacturers for causing diabetes. New York City is a place where they've been very upscale, very forward in terms of trying to stop bad things, smoking. Now they're trying to ban sodas in New York City. There's recently been a trend towards labeling in fast food places like Starbucks, or there's a place called Chili's, for example, in San Francisco. It's a Mexican restaurant. And if you actually read the labels, it's a little frightening. If you get their margarita shrimp cocktail and their enchilada platter, it's about 3,000 calories and 9 grams of sodium. I mean, that's an absurd amount of food, and that's one meal, So the labeling, I think, is really important, and if you can see that, and that might then say, oh my God, I'm not going to eat this, maybe that might help you. And maybe we can do something about the USDA nutritional recommendations. Where am I? Still have 10 minutes left. Okay, there are a couple of other things where we can talk about the effects of Paleolithic diet and lifestyle on health. This is something that, whether or not eating low-carb diets, which essentially causes lowering of marked lowering of insulin levels, and whether or not insulin restriction helps stop cancer growth. This is something that's becoming more and more, they're looking at this more and more. There's a group called the Physicians for Ancestral Health and another group called Nutritional and Functional Medicine, which are actually putting some of these paleo diet recommendations into their clinical practice and teaching this to their patients. The U.S. military is interested in CrossFit. They've been using it for their elite troops like the Army Rangers and the Navy SEALs, and comparing it to their standard types of exercise. CrossFit is an exercise program where instead of just training like one muscle group, let's say by like lifting weights, you train all the muscles in the lower legs by scampering around on your feet and jumping up and down a lot. There's actually a study that just came out which was done in people who do CrossFit, who are supposedly following the Paleolithic diet, showing that actually in the healthy people that did this, their cholesterol and triglyceride levels went up. Although what they said was that the people who were the healthiest, those were the ones whose cholesterol and triglyceride levels went up, and everybody else who wasn't so healthy, there wasn't any difference. Again, I think that the cardiovascular risks, I think that the results that we've seen in the United States are very similar to what these guys have shown in Sweden. I'll talk just a little bit more about this gut microbiome. And then there have been some societal concerns that have been brought up. I live in California, and California has a lot of people who are interested in like minority rights. And part of this has to do with making sure the Native Americans get to eat Native American food and the Hispanics get to eat Hispanic food, and making sure that you eat locally produced foods as opposed to foods that have been trucked in from a long way away. So it's a way of trying to look at how sustainable is a diet where you actually are eating a lot of meat and fish. Let's see. So this was a study done at the University of Virginia, partnered by one of the industries on the East Coast of the United States, where they actually did 70 some odd people in each group, and they tested the paleo diet against the Mediterranean diet, against the DASH diet, against the vegetarian diet. And I emailed the guy who did this, and so what he said is that both the vegetarian and the paleo diet lost the most weight, and that was about 12 pounds, and this is in 2 months. That there was an improvement in blood sugar in most of the groups, that it was, and this insulin resistant index that they calculated dropped particularly in the paleo group. That although there was a significant drop in blood pressure in the paleo group, there was more of a drop in blood pressure in the DASH group. And that's because my personal belief is because that's the one with the biggest drop in sodium intake. And this is a thesis project by somebody at the University of Michigan. In green are the lipid profiles after 4 months of a paleo diet versus in blue, lipid profiles after a healthy heart diet. On the left are the women and on the right are the men. So again, same idea as what we've seen in the other trials where there tends to be drops in lipid levels, although again, that's not universal. I think we can argue about how the studies are done in terms of trying to understand some of the results of the trials. And now finally, so this is a very cool idea that the gut bacteria produce things which can be absorbed into your body, which can affect your health, or can take care of stuff in the gut so that it's not absorbed into your body. And so this guy named Jeff Leach has actually been doing things like he goes around and he eats some diet, and then he looks at the bacteria that's in his gut. And so what he shows here is that on this diet, when he was eating this high meat, high fiber diet, he had this composition of these bacteria. And then a couple weeks later, he moved to a different part of the country. He ate a completely different diet, high meat, but now really low fiber. And after 2 or 3 weeks on this diet, the gut, the proportion of bacteria in the gut had changed completely because he was on a different diet. And the next time I talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about how this might actually be important in kidney disease. And then there's this group over here, which if you send them your stool samples, they will tell you what kind of gut bacteria you have. I don't know what you're supposed to do with this information, but what they're doing is they're actually collecting a database of the bacteria that are in people's guts and presumably what they're eating too, and maybe we can do something with that. And I think most importantly, at least for what I see in the United States, is that it's not just us like at universities who are interested in this. It seems to be a much broader level of the population, and I think that's really terrific in terms of trying to get people interested in trying to do something about their lifestyle. If we're just the ones talking at people, I mean, I'm a doctor, I talk at people all the time. The number of people who actually do what I tell them to do is pretty small. So when you see this kind of more groundswell, I think that's really encouraging. So, I'm really, really pleased to see this. And so maybe, if we can put all of these things together, so better diet, less stress, more activity, get more sleep, who knows, the right gut microbes, whatever, that maybe we can actually make people healthier by doing this. And diet is an important part of this. So, thank you.